Thank you all for showing up on a working day at 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm very touched. I'm delighted to be speaking here because, as some of you may know, I'm actually the patron of this festival. I'm delighted that when I first spoke to Shreyams Kumar, the managing director of the Mathrubhumi group, about creating a literary festival in Thiruvananthapuram that would showcase the intellectualism and cultural capital for which this state capital is so justly famous, that he responded with alacrity. I think we're now in our fourth, is it, or fifth edition? Fourth. We're in our fourth edition, aren't we? Third, I beg your pardon. You see, I'm enjoying it so much, I think it's going on longer than it actually has. Shreyams has signaled to me it's the third edition, but it's become a very welcome fixture on the Kerala literary calendar. In many ways different from the other festivals that have taken place, and at the same time one which attracts a wonderful collection of writers, poets, and audience for each other's work, in addition to what the readers who come actually get a chance to enjoy. So just to say that even if this is not the most convenient time for many people, I'm grateful that so many of you have come, and it's wonderful to see you here this morning. The theme suggested to me by the organizers was who is an Indian? And I think it's no surprise that this issue has come up before us today, because the nation is riven by a debate which at its heart is about this very question. As you know, there is a history to all this, there always is. But what has been the immediate provocation for a national self-interrogation about nationhood has been the decision of the central government to push through with astonishing speed, both houses of parliament, a bill called the Citizenship Amendment Bill, now the Citizenship Amendment Act, since it has received the assent of the President, which for the first time introduces a mention of religious identity in the context of citizenship. As I said, there is a history to this entire issue, and that history goes back to the freedom movement, when there was a very clear split in the struggle against the British. One set of people argued that religion should be the determinant of nationhood. That was the idea of Pakistan, and they created a separate country based on the principle that people of Islamic identity in India were a separate nation from the rest. But Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Maulana Azad, Dr. Ambedkar, you name the leaders of the rest of the freedom struggle, the rest of the nationalist movement, they said this is completely wrong. Religion does not determine our identity or our nationhood. We are Indians above all. Our freedom struggle has been for everybody, and the Constitution we write will reflect that conviction. There's a very interesting new book, since we're at a book festival, I'll mention it, called The Founding by a young constitutional scholar called Madhav Khosla, and I've written a very lengthy 3,000-word review essay in Open Magazine about it, where he demonstrates that there was a very conscious decision in the course of the Constituent Assembly debates to move away from the pernicious British doctrine of group identities, which was created purely for the purposes of divide and rule. If you confine people into self-contained monolithic group identities, it's easier to divide them, control them, and rule them. The British understood that very well. And after the famous revolt of 1857, they had decided in the famous minute of Elphinstone, divide et impera is the old Roman maxim, and it shall be ours. And they did that as a very systematic policy. I've described this at length in my book, An Era of Darkness. And that consciousness of division is what ultimately culminated in partition. But when partition happened, the founding fathers and mothers of our republic said, no, this British policy assumes that your political identity is constructed from something as immutable as your religion, and that therefore it assumes a certain preset collection of loyalties and interests which in fact do not reflect the actual reality of lived experience, that in creating a constitution, we need to help individual Indians to constitute their own political identities by defining themselves as individuals rather than as members of a religious community. And this was a very conscious choice, as Madhav Khosla describes in his book, The Founding. And this choice of creating individual citizens of a new free republic was a choice adopted after discussion and deliberation in the Constituent Assembly, and a decision, for example, to reject the notion of reservations for religious groups and only permit affirmative action for one set of people, the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, who had suffered millennia of discrimination, rather than to assume that every other citizen of India was somehow confined to a political identity by their socio-cultural or religious identity. Now, this is the basis on which the Constitution was written. There are plenty of articles I can cite. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, so I won't pretend to an authority I don't have. But there are plenty of articles reflecting the notion of equality amongst all Indians, religious communities, or any other. And at the end of the day, let's face it, this is how India was built for 72 years. We have been living in a country where individuals have rights and where ultimately your religion, the way you choose to stretch your hands out to your maker, was irrelevant to determining your rights and your obligations, your duties, your opportunities in this republic. And for me, as somebody who thought and wrote and spoke about the Indian political experience over the years, it was a matter of pride that we have had so many different social and religious backgrounds represented in the highest offices of the land, whether it be in Rashtrapati Bhavan, the President of the Republic, whether it be in the armed forces, whether it be in our diplomatic corps, our ambassadors and high commissioners, for that matter, whether it be the captain of the Indian cricket team. Every religious identity, caste identity, has found a place in one form or the other in positions of genuine stature and independence. And authority, I beg your pardon, since independence. And in these circumstances, we find ourselves having accepted that this is who we are, and that Indians are by definition a diverse set of people. As I wrote in one of my books and have been guilty of perhaps overusing since, we have been able to demonstrate that you can overcome differences of caste, of creed, of color, of culture, of cuisine, of conviction, of costume and custom, and still rally around a consensus. And that consensus was on the very simple democratic principle that we, in a diverse democracy like ours, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. And one of those ground rules was your religion does not determine your opportunities or your status in this society. Now we fast forward to what happened in December, when the government brings in a bill that on the face of it merely seeks to grant a fast track to citizenship for people from 3 neighboring countries and 6 identified religions. Their argument is, listen, the 3 countries we have mentioned are all Muslim majority countries and Islamic states. Muslims are not persecuted there, that's why we have left Muslims out. It is non-Muslims who are persecuted, and so we've included them into the bill. Now, first of all, that statement is evidently both illogical and arguably false. It's illogical because there is no underlying principle for picking these 3 countries. If you say it's because partition hived off parts of India into Pakistan and what is now Bangladesh, then how does Afghanistan fit into your list? Afghanistan was never part of India. Conversely, Burma was part of India until the Government of India Act 1935, when it was hived off as a separate country. And yet refugees fleeing Burma are not considered under this act. And there's a good reason, of course, because the refugees fleeing Burma happen to be Muslim. So there is a very conscious and deliberate religious bias in this act that specifically seeks to exclude certain communities, and therefore the logic that you are trying to offer refuge to people from your neighboring countries falls immediately. After all, China is a neighboring country. There are people of various backgrounds who've come and sought refuge here. Sri Lanka is a neighboring country. Not long ago, it was riven by civil war, and we had hundreds of thousands of people crossing over, some admittedly only for temporary refuge, some claiming a well-founded fear of going back, and many of them, ironically, Hindus. But they are excluded from the purview of the bill because Sri Lanka is not named as one of the countries. And the argument there is that it's a different situation. They don't need to be covered. But maybe some may cynically suggest that perhaps the only Hindus of interest to our present government are Hindi-speaking Hindus and not Tamil-speaking ones. So you've got yourself into a situation in which there is no logical reason for either the selection of countries or the listing of religions, other than, to put it crudely, religious majoritarian bias. Now, in these circumstances, I stood up in Parliament and opposed the introduction of the bill itself, saying that this would actually represent a violation of the fundamental assumptions, not only of the Constitution, but of the freedom struggle itself. I said, it's Jinnah who said that religion should determine your citizenship, not Mahatma Gandhi. For the first time, you people are bringing Jinnah's idea into our constitutional arrangements, and if you pass this act, I said, you're essentially going to be sealing the triumph of Jinnah and the defeat of Mahatma Gandhi on all his associates who believed profoundly that this was a wrong approach. Well, we didn't succeed. The bill was introduced. We argued against it. We didn't succeed. The bill was passed. Same thing happened in the Rajya Sabha, and now we have an act that does this. Now, all of that was bad enough in principle for the reasons I've described to you, but then what happened? In the course of the debate in Parliament, the Home Minister made it very clear that the CAA was a precursor to what he called a National Register of Citizens, which he said would be established throughout the country and not merely in the state of Assam, where it had been mandated as a result of the intensive agitation against foreign immigration in the 1980s, but a National Register of Citizens nationwide. Now, naturally, people put two and two together and understood what was afoot, because a National Register of Citizens would be based on an exercise of going door to door and asking questions of people. It's not the same as the census exercise, which is conducted under the Census Act, but is conducted under the Citizenship Act of 1955, and under rules first promulgated for a national population register by the BJP government of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and it is true implemented in 2010 by the UPA government under Home Minister Chidambaram, except that that national population register merely asked you, are you residing here? How long have you been residing here? And do you intend to reside here? It was basically to list the residents of the country. In fact, in some cases, cards were issued at people's request, and the card merely said residential, a proof of residence or card of residence, I've forgotten the exact term, never talked about citizenship and asked for no proof to substantiate citizenship. If you're living at a particular address in India, the government wanted to list that, and it seemed to me an unexceptionable requirement. But in the present government's rules, under the National Population Register, they have added 8 questions that were not there in 2010. And those questions include things like your Aadhaar number, your driving license number, as well as your place of birth and your parents' place of birth. And what is worse still, in the instructions for the enumerators who will go door to door asking these questions, the enumerator is empowered to write against individual names dubious citizenship. Dubious citizenship. And then that dubious citizen can be summoned for further interrogations, and that's where he or she will be obliged to produce documentary evidence of who they are, where they were born, and where their parents are born. Now, perhaps in Kerala this will not turn out to be a big deal, though I'm very pleased and proud that the Kerala government has said they will not actually implement the National Population Register with these rules. But what is interesting is that in India as a whole, it is estimated that 65% of the population does not have valid documentation of their birth. Birth certificates were not routinely issued in most places, in most jurisdictions, until relatively recently, and even there are many areas, particularly rural areas, places where poor people didn't deliver in hospital but at home, tribal people, many Dalit communities and so on, where people simply do not have their birth certificates. Now we all know, we've been following the newspapers, that it was not that long ago that a minister in the Modi government, who was then Army Chief, General V.K. Singh, went to court to say that he didn't have a birth certificate and that the date of birth recorded by the army was wrong because his uncle had admitted him to school. It was based on a school certificate, and the uncle had exaggerated his age in order to get him into school, and his real age had to be revised. The case went all the way to court, but the issue that I'm trying to raise with that is not to point fingers at an individual, but to make the larger point that if a minister of the government cannot provide a document to verify his date of birth and cannot produce a birth certificate, how do we expect a poor Muslim dwelling in a slum, a poor Dalit, a poor Adivasi, a poor villager to produce a document he's never had and never seen and doesn't know where to obtain? And if he had to try and obtain it, would have to go to places where the record keeping is at very best patchy and erratic. Just recently, some of you may have received, going around that wonderful University for Modern Education WhatsApp, you may have seen a YouTube clipping of a population register of births in 1978 in a town in UP, in which every page has been shredded by termites, insects, whatever. 1978, not that long ago. A 41-year-old will be unable to demonstrate his birth in that particular town because the register has been completely eaten up and destroyed beyond the cover page. Now, this is our country. We all know this is our country. This is the way things are. It's never been made into an issue of this nature in the past. Because the question, who is an Indian, was one that each of us instinctively answered, very often by just looking in a mirror. The fact is, however, that we are now facing a situation where identity and nationhood have become a litmus test. So under this NPR, and with the NRC as the objective exercise, you can imagine that the enumerators will go from door to door, and if they find that there are some Hindus or Buddhists or Sikhs or Jains claiming that they are from here or there or whatever, that this will be accepted as not being of dubious citizenship. People of certain undesirable communities, so-called, including in particular the Muslim community, is definitely going to be more vulnerable to being listed as being of dubious citizenship and asked to provide documentation that they may not in fact possess. Now, in these circumstances, we are looking at what is going to be a possible act of mass disenfranchisement. Those who are saying it will lead to deportations and so on are actually not, I think, justified, because you can only deport people where some country is willing to accept them and no other country is going to be willing to accept them, so they will stay. But the government's exercise is to deprive them of the privileges of citizenship, including in particular the right to vote. And this is again a blatantly political exercise masquerading as one of protecting the nation from illegal immigrants. The truth is, illegal immigration is a problem that has not been ever accurately enumerated. There are merely various informal estimates. But in a country of 1.3 billion people, arguably more people are born in a day than could possibly illegally immigrate in a year. And it's extremely unlikely that in any case, if your concern about illegal immigration is the pressure and the strain it places on limited national resources, if you are going to conduct a deeply flawed and catastrophic exercise, which in the end doesn't result in actually returning these people to other countries whose resources they may consume, then in the end, in any case, they're going to be consuming your resources. The only thing they won't have is the vote, which is why it is such a blatantly political exercise. I do want to add a couple more things. on this exercise, if, as I say, people of certain religions are unable or not, perhaps not even asked for documentation, they're undoubtedly going to say. The attitude of the government, of the ruling party, has been very clear. Where else will a Hindu go, they've asked. But if a Muslim, for example, says, listen, I was born here, my parents are born and buried here, but I don't know their place of birth, I don't have their birth certificate, he will probably be marked as being of dubious citizenship, and when he goes off for a second interrogation and he doesn't have documentation, he becomes more vulnerable to the question, how do we know that your father or you didn't migrate from Pakistan or Bangladesh? Now, this how do we know question is something the government has become very fond of asking of late. The onus is no longer on the individual Indian. I beg your pardon, it's no longer on the government to demonstrate that the individual Indian is not an Indian. The onus is on the individual to prove that he is a citizen without any of the means to do so. And compounded by the absolute absurdity that thanks to this government and its arguments made in a high court, I think it was the Bombay High Court, there is actually a ruling on the books that even an Indian passport is not proof of citizenship. I have submitted a question to Parliament, which they may not admit because these things are carefully scrutinized before they're permitted. But I've asked the question, if you don't accept the passport as proof of Indian citizenship, how can you demand that foreign countries accept your passport when Indian citizens travel there? It is one of the most patently absurd arguments and propositions you can possibly imagine for a government to advance. What documentation is more authentic than any other in a country where documentation itself is so flawed? I'm going to wrap this up, but let me come back to the argument of who is an Indian. I've made the argument of the freedom struggle. There's obviously also shall we say, a civilizational argument that for thousands of years we've been a mixture of people from all over the place. Many of us are, I think, proud of and conscious of the visible diversity we see. You step into any Indian railway station, or for that matter, look around this audience, and you will see people of various physiognomies, various colors of skin, various traits and physical appearances, speaking various languages, essentially able to demonstrate our diversity in ways that very few countries are going to be able to do. We have, as a result, been able to evolve a society and a civilization that has so far taken difference for granted. Swami Vivekananda, in his famous speech to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, advanced the proposition which I have been dwelling on for some years since I first came across it as a teenage student, and which I've written about in my books on Hinduism. He advanced the proposition that he said, I'm proud to speak on behalf of a religion. It was the World Parliament of Religions. He was there as the representative of Hinduism. He said, on behalf of a religion that has taught the world not just tolerance, but acceptance. And when you think about it, that's an extraordinarily profound idea. Because tolerance is ultimately at bottom not the big virtue that it is taught in our history books as being, a tolerant king is a good king, we should admire tolerance. Tolerance is at bottom a very patronizing idea, because it says, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. That's basically what tolerance boils down to. Whereas acceptance, which is what Swami Vivekananda claims Hinduism is all about, says, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. And to my mind, that was a fundamental basis, not only for the Hindu religion to live with various forms of worship within it, but also to live with other religions in India. And it became, in many ways, an instinctive, assumed principle of Indian democracy. We're all different. As long as we accept each other's differences, allow everyone to be themselves, then we are going to be in a position, undoubtedly, to be a thriving democracy. And let's face it, it worked. It has worked. The world has been celebrating our democracy. Extraordinary changes have happened in our society. I mean, for example, who would have imagined for 3,000 years a Dalit woman ruling the land of Aryavrat? And yet Mayawati has done so 3 times, right? As a result of the democratic ballot box. Who would have imagined the kinds of social changes that have led to significant OBC domination of certain states in our country? And it's happened again through the power of democracy, through the acceptance of individuals' rights to self-define themselves and be who they are. So when we say who is an Indian is somebody who is many things and one thing. An Indian may be a good Muslim, a good Keralite, and a good Indian all at once. These multiple identities existed within our country and existed within each of us sometimes because the assumption around us was that there was an acceptance of these different identities by the others. So I define myself as I choose. Nobody else has the right to define me. They can accept me, they can dislike me, but they can't define me and I can't define them. I can't pigeonhole them, I can't box them into something else, and we are both Indian. That idea of a land ultimately whose claim to our allegiance was one of belonging rather than of blood or of worship, that idea was what was fundamentally special about who an Indian is and was. Now, I wanted very much to leave some time for interactions with you. So I'm going to try and pause here and take about 15 minutes worth of questions. I know we began late, but I'll leave myself in the hands of the organizers. They want me to finish on time at 11. But just to conclude, ultimately, this is not a battle that's going to be settled on literary festival podiums or in intellectual debates. Currently, it is being waged in the streets, the city squares, the hearts of Indians. You've seen the university campuses where in Jamia, in JNU, in so many universities now, students have come out without any political affiliation and not incited by a political party to stand up for their faith in their Indianness and in the Indianness of others. We've seen the women of Shaheen Bagh or of a chowk in the heart of Lucknow. Ordinary housewives coming out and sitting on the street saying, we protest. You cannot take away our right to be as Indian as you are, Mr. Amit Shah. This message has been a very profound answer to the question. And it seems to me that as we sit here today, it's their faith, their courage, their determination, and their endurance that will ultimately resolve this issue. The government has said it will not pull back the act, and our objection to it remains, and it's entirely possible that the Supreme Court, having read and studied the debates, may still find it unconstitutional for the reasons I've described. But even if the court decides that their act is within the letter of the law, though clearly not within the spirit of the Constitution, I think the intensity of the opposition may give the government pause in proceeding with its reckless and foolhardy decision to impose a national population register and a national register of citizens on this country. And if they don't proceed, that ultimately will be a victory for our different kind of answer to the question, who is an Indian? Thank you for listening to me. I'll take your questions now. Jai Hind. I'll stay here and answer.
So who is an Indian? I don't have a birth certificate. I am an Indian, and I'm very proud to be an Indian.
But can you prove it?
I can prove it in many ways. You've been watching me for the past 30 years, so I'm an Indian. If you have a burning desire to ask Shashi a question on this subject, if you have understood or not understood what it is to be an Indian, we have time for 3 questions.
Good morning, Dr. Tharoor.
Morning.
Do you think Indian politics is being submerged on the ocean of religion?
Unfortunately, our ruling party clearly has this view. You see, there is a historical background to that too. I didn't want to bore you with details. A lot of this is in my book, Why I'm a Hindu, where I've quoted extensively from the writings of the Hindutva ideologues. But they fundamentally disagreed with the Constitution. In fact, there are 3 principal ideologues, V.D. Savarkar, who invented the idea of Hindutva and said that Hindus are people who owned this nation, as it were, and there are those for whom India is their Pitrabhumi, the land of their ancestors, and their Punyabhumi, their holy land, which allows the Sikhs, the Buddhists, the Jains into the Hindu fold, but excludes Christians and Muslims. And then M.S. Golwalkar, who was the longest-serving Sarsang Chalak of the RSS, 1940 to 1973, 33 years. And Deen Dayal Upadhyay, Narendra Modi has hailed as his ideological mentor and guru, the head of the Jansangh till his death. These three have all rejected the Constitution in their lifetimes after its adoption. They had two objections to it. One was that it was written by a bunch of Anglophile lawyers and was full of foreign ideas. Well, my answer is, so what? But that was for them an objection. But the second and more profound objection was, they said it rests on a flawed premise of territorial nationalism. What do they mean? They said it assumes that the nation of India is a territory called India, and the Constitution is written for all the people on that territory. Wrong, they say. A nation is not a territory, a nation is a people, and the people of India are only the Hindu people. So that fundamental critique goes to the heart of all their writings and speeches against the Constitution and the assumptions of the Constitution that I've outlined to you today. And therefore what has happened is that for them, the pursuit of a Hindu Rashtra, the phrase used by all these three ideologues, is consistent with their ideological upbringing, but fundamentally inconsistent with the Constitution. So to that degree, I'm afraid the answer to you is yes. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for that interesting talk.
Thank you.
My question was, if you keep CAA aside and you talk about the national registry, how important is a national registry for any country? And if yes, it is important because we need to know who our citizens are, how do you solve for the problems that you just spoke about? And what is it that one can do?
Well, I think there are a number of things we can think about doing. There could be, for example, multiple proofs accepted. That is that instead of restricting yourself to such an absurdly narrow list that even passports are not considered valid proof of citizenship, you could have X number of proofs accepted, including the testimony of, I don't know, 3 neighbors. God knows that these people have always been here, including things like photographs of your parents' graves, including other kinds of commonsensical proofs of identity, rather than the presumption being that somebody is illegal unless he proves otherwise. The onus should be on the government to disqualify those who are not. Right now, if somebody who, quote unquote, would tomorrow be seen as an illegal immigrant applies for a passport, what do the police look for before they give the so-called police verification? An address, evidence of paying bills there, having a ration card there, perhaps a voter card. They'll check with a few neighbors, is this guy for real? They'll check with the local police station, have there been any suspicious activities? And they'll say, okay, no objection, the passport is issued. This is the way it works. We should have that kind of procedure at worst, rather than one where there is a litmus test based on documentation that our own country is unable to generate adequately. I would certainly agree that in future, especially in the digital era, it should be possible to have especially with the extraordinary backbone of the Aadhaar, we should be able to finally identify those who are Indian citizens, and future generations can be recorded against that database. But to do it now retrospectively is just going to generate a huge amount of flagrant injustice. That's my concern. So let's work in the real world. I'm not disagreeing that many countries, of course all of them smaller than ours, have such registers or lists of citizenship or even citizens' identity cards, but we never have, and to start to construct one with retrospective effect would be calamitous. I mean, it's actually safer administratively to just say going forward every Indian will have to have his birth recorded, whatever the circumstances might be. If you happen to be born abroad to Indian parents, you already can record it in an Indian embassy or high commission. By the same logic, if you are born at home, go to the nearest village office or thing office, unfortunately stand in a queue for hours, but get the certificate. Everybody is entitled to one. Find some ways of going forward in future. But don't go backward when our country is so poorly documented that even a minister doesn't have what you're asking some poor Dalit or Muslim to provide.
Thank you for the fabulous speech. My question is actually, why does a country like India, which is surrounded by religious republics and we have China, why does a country like India doesn't have a refugee policy, or rather a refugee law or asylum for that matter?
Excellent question, because I have asked the same question in Parliament.
So isn't it partly the failure of the previous governments?
It's a failure of all governments, and I have actually introduced a private member's bill, because as you may know, I spent 11 years of my life working for refugees at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and pretty much every democracy in the world has either signed the International Convention and Protocol and or, in most cases it's and, has a national asylum law under which anyone can apply for refugee status, and a procedure by law is followed to determine whether that person is a refugee. So all it requires is for the person to demonstrate a well-founded fear of persecution on specified grounds: race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, that can be caste, that can be gender orientation, any social group, or political opinion. So for example, a Bangladeshi Muslim who's persecuted for his or her political opinions, and we all know a couple of cases that we have given asylum to in the last 20 years from that country, that person may be a Muslim but would be eligible, whereas under the CAA they would not be eligible. Or people within, for example, Ahmadiyas in Pakistan. India deems them to be Muslims, Pakistan deems them not to be, and many are persecuted. Shias in various parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Hazaras in Afghanistan, and so on, they're all deemed to be Muslims and therefore would not attract the protections of the CAA, but would be covered under objective religion-neutral refugee law.
Actually, even in these present political narratives, no one is actually putting forward an all-inclusive refugee law. So why is that not happening? Not even one single large parties are putting forward an all-inclusive refugees law.
No, I have done that. It's already before the parliament, but the government is not interested. I actually went and saw the Home Minister, all his ministers of state, and the Home Secretary, and I said, I have no author's pride in this. You can take it over and write your own law based on these principles, which reflect international standards, and let's have a policy that we can show the entire world with pride. They have refused because they would rather have their arbitrary, ad hoc, unsustainable approaches. Even when this act was being passed, I tried to move an amendment saying, let us remove the reference to religion and replace it with persecuted persons. And they shouted that amendment down. So it's very consciously, deliberately on part of the government a desire not to have a globally applicable standard, because they really, I'm sorry to say, are strongly biased against our Muslim brothers and sisters. And as far as they're concerned, that community has to be excluded from any benefit that the law or any such law might give them. Whereas a universal religion-neutral law would obviously also apply to Muslims as it would to anybody else. Yes.
Hi, sir. It's an awesome topic. My question is, one of my school friends said that he was born in Dubai. Some years before, his father was dead. He don't have any document to prove her birth certificate. So he feared about that kind of rule is established. Which method he proved his identity? This is the main reason for facing many other caste or many Muslim community peoples. So my question is, how to overcome these kind of situations? Because many of the friends told the same thing, because born in other country but don't have any certificate to prove the birth.
No, that the ones born in other countries are actually better off than people here, because in all those cases, their parents would have gone to the local Indian embassy or High Commission and got themselves a passport or get themselves registered in the parents' passport, and that continuing documentation would
But
obviously be...
Passport is not an identity.
Currently, I agree. The rules are so absurd, but I'm hoping that will be overturned. I'm advocating for that to be overturned, because the truth is, your friend in Dubai has not lived in Dubai all his life. He has traveled to India, he's had a passport. Yes. How did he get that passport? The Embassy of India or the consulate in Dubai has obviously verified his antecedents and said, yes, he's a Muslim. I mean, beg your pardon, yes, he's an Indian. That process, it should be deemed to be enough. And I think that is one of the easiest things. If this High Court decision can be appealed to the Supreme Court, I'm reasonably confident people like that will say, my father proved I'm an Indian, that's why I have a passport, but now he's no longer around, I don't know who his birth certificate is. I think that should be admissible. Otherwise, we will have chaos, confusion, and catastrophe really on the ground in any such exercise in India. But the bigger worry is, of course, for those who have nothing and who are already in India and can be deemed to be illegal.
Sir, Article 14 is equal for all Indian persons, like
Correct.
refugees or Indian citizen or any other countries. So, is this Article 14 violation for this kind of rule?
That's what we are, one of the arguments before the Supreme Court in the various petitions against the CAA is that it's a violation of Article 14C. It's not the only argument, but it's certainly a very important argument because the argument applies to any persons on Indian soil. Any person shall not be denied the benefits of Article 14. So therefore, I'm reasonably hopeful. I feel there is a better than 50% chance that the Supreme Court is going to invalidate the present wording of the Act. But anything is possible. We have to wait for their judgment.
Sir, you mentioned that CAA is a precursor to
NRC.
national publishing.
No, I didn't mention it. The Home Minister.
Home Minister.
Home Minister mentioned.
Do you think that such persons are Joseph Goebbels in disguise?
You know, I'm always wary of these historical analogies. People are too quick to compare people to Hitler and Goebbels and so on because each era is different, each time is different, each country is different. But certainly we can learn lessons from history. One of the most famous consequences, as you remember, of what happened in Nazi Germany was that magnificent poem by Pastor Martin Niemöller, who famously said, first they came for the Jews and I said nothing because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the socialists and I said nothing because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists and I said nothing because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for me and there was no one left to speak for me. So ultimately our message today is we don't want a version of that says first they came for the Muslims and we said nothing because we were not Muslims. Then they came for the Dalits and we said nothing because we were not Dalits. Then they came for the communists and we said nothing because we were not communists. And finally they came for us and there was no one left to defend us. That is the big danger that we would face if we follow down the path of history.
Good morning, sir.
Morning.
That was an illuminating talk.
Thank you.
Okay, my question is regarding the vulnerability of Indian Constitution and what is your stand that we, the people of India, will we face a drastic change at the constitution level from pretty good time from now? And do you think this is the central government's new historicist way of creating a new history, replacing the old one?
That is exactly my fear. Thank you for putting it so clearly. I've written about this. I didn't go that far in the talk because we are at an early stage of their agenda. And they may also find other ways, you see, of achieving the same objective. I certainly feel that they will never need to declare an emergency. In any case, the internal emergency is no longer possible after the amendments of 1977. But they will never need to declare an emergency because they seem to be achieving the same objective without actually going through a legal declaration of a state of emergency. Similarly, I had argued that they will just tear up our constitution and write a new Hindutva constitution. But I'm beginning to wonder whether they actually need to do that. They may simply push through a series of amendments and interpretations to the existing constitution through their pliant majority in both houses until finally we have an operating constitution that looks nothing like the constitution we have known and loved and understood for 70-odd years and which various scholars have described and written about. Gradually over a period of time, you may find it being changed in its workings to something very unrecognizable from what we have all known for the last few decades. Your generation, young lady, will have to fight that fight because it's going to be, I'm afraid, done over a period of time the way these things are going. Right now, they've been a bit stunned, I think, by the popular resistance. And they may slow down. As I said, I'm still hopeful that they will not proceed with these questions. They will not proceed with the irrational proofs of citizenship, and they will not, therefore, try and get to a situation where the country will be divided catastrophically by an NRC. I may still be wrong, but I'm hopeful that they will pause after seeing the public reaction. But I don't think they're going to abandon their longer-term goals. They're in this for the long haul. Their fundamental ideological objective remains to convert this large, diverse country into a Hindu Rashtra. They've made no bones about it for many, many decades. I mean, in 2 years, they'll be celebrating the centenary of the establishment of the RSS and the writing of Savarkar's book on Hindutva. That centenary is not long in Indian history, and they're quite prepared to take a long view, because for about 60 of those 100 years, they were ciphers on the margins of Indian politics. And they have grown steadily in the last 35, 40 years to the position of dominance they've now assumed, and they're not going to lightly want to relinquish it. So all of you, particularly the younger generation, should be prepared to fight and should be prepared to resist this kind of violation of the fundamental issue of our Indianness and our Indian nationhood. Thank you all very much for a wonderfully stimulating morning. I was quite willing to stay, but I think Shreyams, do you want me to wrap up now? We'll have to wrap up. Thank you all very much.